Welcome back to your Monday Buckeye Talk. Doug Maurice and Nathan Baird. We're doing Monday Madness. That means we're talking about an Ohio State issue. We're talking about a national college football issue. And then at the end, what you watching? I think we'll do some Oscar talk there. What you eating, what you thinking. And I have a particular thing that happened that made me feel old. There are a lot of things that make me feel old, though. So this was a specific thing that also made me feel kind of grateful and wistful, mostly old though. But Nathan, we're going to start talking about the Ohio State Buckeyes. And this is kind of a national topic and an Ohio State topic at the same time. And you have looked this up, and I will say you sent this along to me, but also I am now sports betting is kind of just like a part of my day. Now I have multiple apps. I reference them. I sprinkle here and there. I thought the other night that the Nets were coming off a back-to-back and a long road trip, and they were home, but they were coming off a tough loss to the Sixers, and the Pistons had 2 days off. So I took the Pistons on the money line at plus 235, and that hit. So, of course, you only talk about – by the way, everyone knows that. You only talk about gambling your wins, right? Everyone's well, that person must win all the time. It's like I can show you the losses. But anyway, so in a world where gambling – on your phone is now legal in Ohio, looking up things like, hey, what are the futures title odds in college football just become a much more normal part of your day and easier to do. But that's what we're going to start on this Buckeye Talk. National title odds for 2023 and where Ohio State fits into that discussion. Where do the Buckeyes fit in, Nathan?
Well, I thought this was a good way now, as we talked earlier this week, how we're sort of resetting the year, because this is now the Ohio State's national placement is always a topic of conversation. It frames how we talk about the roster. It frames how we talk about the coaching staff. It frames how we talk about each game. But now we also have, where does Michigan fall into that? And I think the head-to-head comparison of Ohio State and Michigan, because of what the Wolverines have done head-to-head with Ohio State the last 2 years, now changes this conversation a little bit. I think we look at the offseason and look ahead to numbers like this a little bit differently. So this is per FanDuel, and these were as of January 19th. So I don't know. I doubt they have changed that much in the last 8 days. But not shockingly, Georgia is the national championship favorite per that site. This is at plus 250. And I'll give you I think that number is really only given as a reference to where everybody else is, obviously. Alabama is number 2 at plus 450. And then Ohio State is third at plus 700. And Michigan behind that plus 1,200. And just for context, USC and Clemson come in next after that, plus 1,600, LSU plus 1,800. But I thought that was an interesting thing to see, that Ohio State is closer to Georgia than Ohio State is to Michigan in terms of the odds. Georgia at plus 250, Ohio State plus 700, and then Michigan plus 1,200. And we had speculated about that immediately after the game, that who is going to be picked to win the Big Ten next year after Michigan's beaten Ohio State head-to-head 2 years in a row and has so many good players coming back. Who is going to be higher than in the first AP poll of the preseason? Will it be Ohio State or will it be Michigan? Now that Michigan has sort of claimed that spot. And I think that what we see there is somewhat reflective of the last game that both of those teams played, which was, regardless of what they did head-to-head, when they went on the national stage, Ohio State was right there, an eyelash away from beating Georgia and then probably winning the national championship after that. And Michigan gave up 1 billion points to TCU and looked like it was going to get boat raced at one point. I think that is probably reflected in the way those lines are set right now.
So this is an interesting season because it's the same place that we were 2 years ago, where after the 2020 season going into 2021, Ohio State, Alabama, and Clemson, at the time, the three big dogs in college football, all had new starting quarterbacks. It was going to be DJ Uiagalelei at Clemson, Bryce Young at Alabama, and CJ Stroud at Ohio State. They're the three top recruits in that quarterback class. They were all going to be starters as second-year quarterbacks. And you just, no matter how good they are and how good the teams are, it's hard to go 3 for 3, and they didn't go 3 for 3. They went 2 for 3. Bryce and CJ worked. DJ did not. And we are at a place right now, Nathan, when you think about odds like this in the national scene, Alabama, new quarterback next year. And I don't think they know who it's going to be. I guess probably Ty Simpson. Jalen Milroe was the guy who played this season when Bryce was out. There's still sort of like this percolating. Will Bama get a transfer portal quarterback? You don't know who Alabama's quarterback is going to be. Ohio State has a battle with Kyle McCord and Devin Brown where you don't know for sure who Ohio State's quarterback is going to be. And Stetson Bennett is leaving Georgia. And Clemson is not a big dog right now, so Clemson's going to have Cade Klubnik. But Georgia is the out of the team now, obviously. So Stetson Bennett is gone, and it's going to be Carson Beck probably, or maybe Brock Vandegrift, or it's not. So the three best teams, three best programs, three best teams are all going to have new quarterbacks. And then, Nathan, Michigan has a third-year dude back. J.J. McCarthy's back. Washington, Michael Penix is still there. Florida State has its quarterback back. Oregon has its quarterback back. Texas has its quarterback back. So many teams in the next tier have veteran quarterbacks returning, but the three best teams do not. And it creates, I think, an interesting dynamic because a lot of times our certainty about any team in the offseason is directly related to its quarterback situation. And you can have optimism and hope and the idea that we always say, well, Ohio State's going to have a good quarterback. Maybe you don't know who it's going to be, but the guy will be good. Georgia's going to have a good quarterback. You don't know who it's going to be, but the guy will be good. Same for Alabama. But are those three programs going to go 3 for 3 in finding the right guy, in being able to contend for a national title when they're going to be playing quarterbacks who have not really played before? And then when you're looking, I'll tell you one of the things when you start looking at like off the radar stuff. We did this on the College Football Survivor Show, and we were kind of talking about who could be the TCU of 2023, sort of this off the radar team. And I can't remember who I said. It's probably because I didn't pick a very good team. But Shahan said Wisconsin. And the idea of a team in the Big Ten, if Wisconsin keeps the best of what they do and adds this whole new world of a passing game with Tanner Mordecai at quarterback and Phil Longo as the offensive coordinator and Luke Fickell bringing it all together, Luke Fickell might be where Sonny Dykes is, right? You know, and Luke Fickell's more. Sonny Dykes was good before. Luke Fickell's been in the playoff. So, like, what do you think about Wisconsin? So, that quarterback thing, Nathan, I think we should, right? Those are the three best programs. They have the shortest national title odds, but we don't know who their starting quarterbacks are, which makes it all a little bit goofy in January, at least.
Yeah, so maybe that's actually a better way to look at what those odds are, that they're baked into, again, regardless of what those results were last year. There is right now, I think, a confidence nationally that regardless of who Georgia's quarterback is, their infrastructure is going to be national championship caliber. And regardless of Alabama's quarterback, there is reasonable certainty that they're going to have a pretty loaded roster otherwise. And for Ohio State, regardless of who Ryan Day picks at quarterback, he'll probably work out because that keeps happening at Ohio State. Now we're in our fifth administration or whatever you want to say, I guess, or sixth, I suppose, but, definitely, Haskins, Fields, Stroud, and now you're moving on to whoever ends up winning this job this spring and summer. So I think some of that is reflected there too, that these programs have pushed themselves up. But I also do think that if I were a Michigan fan and looked at this, I would probably feel a little bit disrespected after what they've done the last 2 years, especially beating Ohio State head-to-head, and the fact that they do have a quarterback coming back who did not have a Heisman caliber year, but proved he could win big games, go on the road to Ohio State and win, and do it like largely as a result of how that quarterback executed. That answers some of those questions. That shouldn't be like a question you have about Michigan, I think, at this point. Maybe there's a question about his production ceiling, but the fact that he can do, frankly, kind of Stetson Bennett-ish things, like just be the guy who goes in and finds a way to win tough games in big moments. Didn't do it against TCU, but absolutely did it against Ohio State, has done it in back-to-back Big Ten championship games, too, against, I know, not playoff caliber teams. So I would still, that does surprise me still a little bit, the discrepancy between Ohio State and Michigan there, because I wonder what the voting will be like eventually within the Big Ten going into this season. Like, do people still see Ohio State at that great of a separation above Michigan right now?
And as we know, this is all about public money.
Yeah.
So the idea of I could see a world where, as you said right now, Ohio State's 7-1 and Michigan's 12-1. But when we do our cleveland.com preseason Big Ten survey, Michigan's picked. I could see a world where when we get down to the coaches poll and the AP poll in the preseason, the gap between Michigan and Ohio State, I don't know. Maybe Michigan's ahead. I don't know. But I bet all those gaps will be smaller than 12-1 to 7-1, which is where the odds are right now.
But to be fair, maybe it's also a reflection of people who watched last year and said, like, well, regardless of what happened in that game, which one was actually better positioned to win a national championship? Which one actually had a better team that was national championship caliber? I think that was probably proven out again by what they saw a few weeks later in the semifinals. So that is also, that's the most fresh thing in people's minds. And I keep saying people, but it's, as you make a very good point, that this isn't necessarily a judgment of team strength. It is a reflection of other factors that are going into why a line is set. But that is right now, just nationally, that is the thing that people have the most fresh in their minds is Ohio State coming 1 point away from beating Georgia in Atlanta, as opposed to whatever happened in Columbus.
So to the other point that I was making, let's run through this real quick. This is everybody who's 30-1 or less to win the national title in order. Nathan already did the odds. Georgia, not sure who the quarterback's going to be. Bama, not sure who the quarterback's going to be. Ohio State, not sure. Michigan, J.J. McCarthy, returning starter. USC, Caleb Williams, Heisman winner, returning starter. Clemson, Cade Klubnik, started the bowl game. Everybody was waiting for him. Even Dabo, after the season, said, I kind of was waiting for Cade Klubnik to take the job. So he wasn't the starter last year, but he's more of a known quantity than anybody at the other three schools. LSU, Jaden Daniels, back as the starter. Notre Dame, getting Sam Hartman from Wake Forest, multi-year starter in Power 5, veteran guy. Florida State, Jordan Travis, back as the starter. Penn State, Drew Aller's going to start. Don't know a ton about him, but we know who it's going to be. So I don't know if that is Penn State in much of a different place than Ohio State is with quarterback. They're going to play a young guy who hasn't started. Well, at least they know who it's going to be. Again, as Ryan Day would say, well, I'd rather have two. Penn State's got Drew Aller. Whether Drew Aller looks awesome or terrible in the spring, Drew Aller's the starter in August. Ohio State has two options. Washington, Michael Penix, back. Led the nation in passing yards, back. Tennessee, lost Hendon Hooker. I guess it's going to be Joe Milton, the former Michigan transfer. So that's similar level of uncertainty. Yeah. Oregon, Bo Nix, stayed at Oregon. Veteran guy going to be back. Texas, Quinn Ewers, back. So that's quarterback. And the teams at the top, some uncertainty. I don't know. I'd spin it. But if you're Michigan, to your point, I don't know. I guess I'd try to spin some. How dare those betting apps? You ever get, hey, you guys ever have a phone? I don't know. I remember back, John and I, we'd have a phone, and, what is a phone? It's just a way that, you bring people together and talking, and now there's apps, and saw a meme, there's an app and a meme, and what's an app? And, just a phone. So, and now, but their phone's saying like, hey, screenshot this. Bam! How dare you? How dare you, sir? 12-1 versus 7-1. I could be outraged. You can get them outraged about that.
And now they're posting these on YouTube. People will finally know that it isn't actually Jim Harbaugh that just jumped on the podcast at a moment's notice. They'll know it was just you talking. It's not nearly as fun. The illusion has been.
See when I shake my head, when I do other impersonations. Great. You're the guy who wanted to blame Nathan.
Blame me. I am the one. I pulled the curtain back on the Wizard of Oz here.
And you can't see it, but I have a monkey. If you're on YouTube, I have a monkey behind me. On the pod, you can't see it.
Yeah. I can't see. I was just actually noticing the monkey as you went into as Jim joined us. And
yeah,
I guess the way I would look at it though is like if we're picking like who, I think you're making another good point. Like if you're actually picking who, if you're gonna put a bet down, what teams are like the most interesting odds? I don't know if it's any of those top three. I think it's a lot of these teams that are down below that, because of starting with Michigan and really kind of working your way down. There are a lot of really interesting teams there. It's certainly as far as like odds just to make the playoff, which I don't have right in front of me. But some of those other teams are really intriguing there, because if you're, USC or Oregon, where you may only have like one really good team that you have to get past, or Washington. Yeah, I mean, actually, never mind. That's actually a really interesting top of the Pac-12 this year. But you know what I'm saying? Like, there's some teams out there that have like already had a good infrastructure, and they've got a returning quarterback, and like now what's the opportunity in front of them in terms of schedule, etc. I think there's probably some interesting bets to be made out there.
And it's hard because, again, like we're talking about, these are national championship bets. I'm not seeing like make the playoff kind of bets. Of course, there's going to be conference champions, that kind of thing. But it's like, hey, whatever TCU was in the preseason, 200-1. If you bet them to win the national championship, you didn't win.
No, but
maybe you could cash out or hedge, like
exactly.
hedge when you get to the title game. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, you can do that sort of thing. Like if you have enough money down on the 200-1 and they get far enough, a lot of times that side will come back around and be like, hey, you want to just, how about take this less money than wait to see if the lottery ticket pays off?
So there is a way, I guess there is a way that there's still value to. I'm like, well, TCU was $1 million to 1 and I put $1 on them. And I could have won $1 million, but I won 0. Like that actually, if you know the tiny little bit about betting, that doesn't have to be how it shakes out. But the hard thing about this is like sort of what you're talking about is like, ooh, there's going to be a surprise team. The hard thing is picking which surprise team, right? But if you're like, you know what, I had like a Drake May spell for a moment, like 1 week on the Survivor Show. I was like, Drake May is going to win the Heisman. North Carolina is 80-1, right? I mean, if you want to go down the Luke Fickell is Sonny Dykes road, Wisconsin's 100-1, right? I mean, if you want to think that Kansas State was just scratching the surface, Kansas State is 200-1. If you think Oregon State is a bubbling powerhouse and they just got DJ Uyunglele transferred to Oregon State, Jonathan Smith's a great coach. Oregon State's coming off a 10-win season. I think it's there, 200-1. But are they going to beat Georgia? It's like they might make the playoff. They'd be like, that's a heck of a conversation. Could they be 6th, 5th, maybe get in at 4th? Are they going to beat Alabama? What's the world in which because then we saw, Nathan, when you're making this conversation and this bet, what's the actual conversation here? It's TCU, Georgia, right? Yep. What are we talking? Like what? Like how TCU was awesome this year, and they were how many miles were between TCU and Georgia? So then, really, at the top, there was an inch between Ohio State and Georgia. There was a marathon between TCU and Georgia. So I do think that's why you get back to these three teams again. Public money, of course, but also it's just about realism. And that the 12-team playoff is going to be great. There's going to be a whole different world of thinking about things. But when you really get down to it, I think we've bridged the gap for the first conversation about greater parity in college football, which is more teams in the playoff, right? Shahan and I have been doing the Survivor Show for 2 years now. And it started off the first 8 years of the playoff. It was Ohio State, Clemson, Alabama, and Oklahoma had taken up 2/3 of the spots. And now we're in a world where we've seen Cincinnati, we've seen TCU, we've seen Michigan rise up and Georgia rise up. None of those teams were the teams in the conversation the first 8 years. They've made it. Now, the next question is, who can really win it? Because I think there's 30 teams, 18 teams who could make the playoff. You know, there's a TCU or a Cincinnati out there from a crop of teams. But who can really win it? Because in the end, how close were TCU and Cincinnati to really winning the national title? I mean, they had a shot, but they weren't. They were in the fight, but nobody actually looked at them in the end and said, "Oh no, that's." Now, if Desmond Ridder played a little bit better against Alabama, I don't know. But still, Cincinnati wasn't going to beat Alabama and Georgia. And TCU just was, that's 100 times out of 100 they lose to Georgia. So that's next, Nathan. And I don't know when we'll get there. I'll be curious how the 12-team playoff affects that. But right now, even for Michigan, Michigan has the 4th best odds. Michigan needs to show a little bit more. They ascended this year. I think they got closer to being a team that you could legitimately pick for the national title. They were closer to that in 22 than they were in 21. So they're still ascending, but are they there, right? And I think a lot of that conversation in the end is the conversation we always have, which is, if you're going to play a great defense, can you throw it well enough to do it? But maybe J.J. McCarthy in year 3 can. But that's why those 3 teams are separated at the top, because in that conversation, it's still the playoff conversation has broadened. The national championship conversation is still pretty tight.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think, though, that Michigan, this will be kind of an interesting year for them, because I think you're right, the 2021 could have maybe been dismissed as like flukish or whatever. They lost to a Michigan State team that was good, but certainly not great. They then get some things in their favor at in the Ohio State game, whether it's the snow, whether it's the illnesses. That I'm not making excuses for Ohio State, but those things did factor into how Michigan was able to win that game. And Michigan also did just kind of kick their butt. But to come back and then do it again, and to go into Ohio Stadium and do it, I thought just showed that now you're not comparing a team to a team. You start comparing a program to a program, and the program strength starts to shift. It's something that Ohio State has to answer in an important way this year. Now they have to go back into Ann Arbor this year and find some way to kind of take that back. And I'm really intrigued by what Michigan, how they handle this, because it was another offseason of will he or won't he with Harbaugh and other weird things going around that program. And how do they respond to that and try to stay at this level? Because it's a hard thing to hold on to. As Ohio State can tell you, I mean, you've pointed out many times how they've stayed in that sort of top 6 land, but to stay in that top 3 is so much tougher, and you can fall out of that pretty easy. So how does Michigan stay up there, or how does, maybe I guess more to the point, how does Ohio State come back and find a way to take that back from them?
And also, this discussion, national title odds, it's not a bet on the Ohio State-Michigan game, because does Ohio State have to beat Michigan to win the national title?
No,
was this year a fluke? Or, is this an actual path? And when you think about the teams on Ohio State's schedule, I do think Wisconsin has a chance to be a pretty competitive team in 2023, and Ohio State has to go to Wisconsin. So it's one of these things. It's like, if we're going to talk about Ohio State as a national title contender, they have to beat Wisconsin. But a win on the road at Wisconsin might be a really good win. A win at Notre Dame might be a really good win. Like, they might be have even more of a case as an 11-1 non-Big Ten champ. Or guess what? Maybe you lose to Michigan, but Michigan loses to Penn State and loses a crossover game, and all of a sudden that this is, I don't know. I haven't found it. I don't know what the betting odds are on Ohio State, Michigan in Ann Arbor in 2023. That game. I don't know what the line is on that game. But that is not the same as betting Ohio State to win the national championship. So, it could be like, Michigan is favored at home against Ohio State. But Ohio State is still a heavier national title pick than Michigan is. And I'm not so sure that might not make sense. It's there's still a way, and especially, and I actually wanted to ask you this question about this. And we're not betting experts. We could have Tishu come on and talk about this at some point. In a 12-team playoff world that will start in 2024, will that increase or decrease Ohio State's preseason national championship odds? Because the playoff path gets tougher, but getting in the playoff gets easier. And as much as Ohio State has lost in the semifinal to Clemson, twice has lost in the semifinal to Georgia, I would say Ohio State's biggest issue is getting in the playoff. Whereas Michigan, maybe its biggest issue is beating multiple elite teams in a playoff. So how do you think the 12-team playoff will affect how we view Ohio State, whether it's reflected in betting odds or just in our perception of Ohio State's chances to win it all?
It's a good question, and you're right that someone like Tishu would be a better person to speculate on that and maybe steady it, which I'm sure he'll do going into next year when they start doing that, or 2024, I should say. But I think it's a good point that in general, the Ohio State issue with the playoff has not been they're basically considered to have national championship caliber roster more or less every year. It's just a matter of do they get tripped up before they get a chance to prove it. And that hasn't been the case with Michigan. There was obviously a long stretch there where they were considered good, but not national championship relevant. But again, that is where they've started to make the turn. And so now they've got their foot in the door. Do they take advantage of that and make another step this year, or does Ohio State come in and sort of knock them to the side and prove what seems to be still the consensus nationally that that's still the superior program at the end of the day?
I do think I would have a greater belief in Ohio State winning a national championship in a 12-team playoff, because I think their biggest issue is getting in. And I think it's going to be hard for anybody. Oh, now you got to beat Florida State and Penn State and Alabama, or you've got to beat Georgia and Alabama and Clemson. I get it. But I think I would have a greater belief in their ability to do that than, like, I would say, no, I think they can do that. But knowing, well, if they lose to Michigan, they're probably still in. They can lose a goofy game in October to somebody and they're still in, as opposed to like the razor thin margins that exist for everybody right now, when everybody wants the Big Ten to be better, but then a better Big Ten makes it harder for Ohio State to go undefeated. And if you're not undefeated in the regular season, you just don't know. So I think Ohio State becomes a heavier national. I would feel better betting on Ohio State, I think, in the 12-team playoff than in the 4-team playoff. Because I would think, okay, here's my preseason bet. I'm pretty sure they're going to make it. And then once they're in, I think they have as good a shot as anybody. As opposed to, like, they better not have a bad Saturday this fall, or they're not even going to get the chance to get there. So I'll be curious to see how all that shakes out. Okay, we'll take a quick break.